When I was growing up in Southern California, London existed in my head the same way it probably exists in a lot of Americans' heads. It was Big Ben, red buses, royal guards who never smiled, rainy streets, people saying cheers every 5 minutes, and buildings that looked like they'd been standing since the dinosaurs. Every movie, every TV show, every travel brochure seemed to reinforce the same picture. London felt less like a real city and more like a giant outdoor museum where everyone somehow had perfect British accents. So when I packed my life into a few suitcases and moved here 2 years ago, I thought I already had a pretty good idea of what to expect. I was wrong. Not just a little wrong. The kind of wrong where, after living here for a while, I realized I hadn't really understood London at all. I only understood the version of London that had been carefully edited for tourists, movies, and history books. The funny thing is that none of those images are completely fake. Big Ben is real. Buckingham Palace is real. The guards are very much real. And yes, they really do stand there looking impossibly serious, while tourists try everything short of juggling to make them laugh. But after living here, I realized those famous places are just tiny pieces of an incredibly complicated city. Imagine trying to explain New York using only Times Square, or Los Angeles using only the Hollywood Walk of Fame. You wouldn't really understand how people actually live there. That's exactly what I had been doing with London. I confused its postcards with its personality. One of the biggest surprises hit me before I even understood why it felt so strange. I'd spend one weekend exploring one neighborhood, then visit another the following weekend, and it honestly felt like I had traveled to a different city. At first, I thought I was imagining it. One place had sleek glass towers reflecting the sky. Another had narrow streets lined with centuries-old houses covered in ivy. Somewhere else felt full of music, markets, murals, and vintage shops. Then I'd find myself walking beside deer in a huge park, wondering how this was still technically the same city. I kept asking myself the same question: how could one place have such wildly different personalities? Coming from Southern California, I was used to cities having a fairly obvious center. You know where downtown is, you know where the business district is. Everything else kind of radiates outward. That's how my brain naturally organized cities. Even places like Chicago or New York have a skyline that tells you this is the center. I assumed London would work the same way. Instead, every time I thought I'd found downtown, someone would casually mention another neighborhood on the other side of the city where people also worked, shopped, and spent their evenings. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where every piece insisted it was the middle. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and also like and hype this video, as I have lots of experiences to tell you. Eventually, I discovered that the problem wasn't London. It was my expectation. London doesn't really have one dominant downtown in the American sense. Instead, it has multiple centers that grew for different reasons over hundreds of years. Financial workers fill the city and Canary Wharf during the week. Government revolves around Westminster. Creative industries thrive around places like Soho and Hackney. Tech companies have transformed parts of Shoreditch. None of these completely replaces the others. They're all important, and together they create a city that feels less like one giant organism and more like dozens of neighborhoods sharing the same passport. Once I learned a little history, everything suddenly made sense. Modern London wasn't designed all at once. It wasn't drawn neatly onto a blank map with straight streets and perfect grids. For nearly 2,000 years, villages slowly expanded toward each other until eventually they touched. Places like Chelsea, Greenwich, Hampstead, Islington, and Camden all existed long before anyone thought of Greater London as one enormous metropolis. During the Industrial Revolution, as railways expanded and the population exploded, those separate communities gradually merged together. On a map today, they look connected, but their personalities never completely blended. That historical accident still shapes everyday life in ways I never expected. People here often identify strongly with their neighborhood or borough. Ask someone where they live, And they probably won't just say London, they'll say Brixton, Richmond, Camden, Hackney, Greenwich. To a visitor, those names might just be stops on the tube map. To the people who live there, their identities. Local cafes know regular customers. Favorite pubs become extensions of people's living rooms. Weekend routines revolve around nearby parks, markets, and high streets. It reminded me less of one giant city and more of a collection of small towns that happen to share the same transportation system. I noticed this in my own life without realizing it. When I first arrived, I thought every weekend would involve crossing the city to discover somewhere new. And for a while, it did. But gradually, my daily life shrank into a comfortable rhythm. I found my favorite bakery, my regular grocery store, the coffee shop where the barista started recognizing me, the little park where I'd take a walk after staring at my laptop all afternoon. I work remotely, so some days my world becomes surprisingly small. It's funny because I technically live in one of the biggest cities in Europe, yet there are entire weeks when I barely leave my corner of it. That local rhythm is one reason London feels so different from many American cities. In a lot of places back home, driving connects everything. You think nothing of getting in the car and spending 30 minutes crossing town for dinner. Here, people often build their lives much closer to home. They walk, they hop on a bus, they meet friends at the neighborhood pub instead of driving across the city. Because so much is within walking distance or a short tube ride away, communities stay surprisingly local despite being surrounded by millions of people. One afternoon, I accidentally stumbled across what perfectly captured this idea. I had completely ignored Google Maps because, honestly, Google Maps and London's streets have a complicated relationship. I wandered down a quiet residential street expecting it to lead back toward a busy road. Instead, I found tiny cottages, flowers spilling over brick walls, and people chatting outside a neighborhood cafe. It felt peaceful enough to be a village in the countryside. I checked my phone and realized I was only minutes away from crowded streets packed with buses, offices, and tourists. The transition was almost absurd. It was like opening the wrong door in a hotel and somehow walking into another country. That happens because London grew organically rather than according to one grand master plan. Many roads still follow routes laid out centuries ago, some tracing Roman roads, old farm boundaries, or paths connecting villages long before cars existed. If you've ever wondered why London streets seem determined to confuse your GPS, that's part of the reason. They weren't built for modern traffic. They evolved gradually as people walked between communities over hundreds of years. Suddenly, those winding roads stopped feeling random. The more I explored, the more I realized that every neighborhood tells a different story. Canary Wharf feels futuristic, almost like someone dropped part of Singapore into Britain. Richmond has riverside walks, huge parks, and actual deer wandering around. Camden feels energetic and creative, with music echoing through its streets and markets that seem to reward getting lost. South Kensington feels elegant and international, surrounded by museums and beautiful architecture. None of these places feels fake. None feels more real than the others. They're simply different chapters of the same book. Looking back, I think this was the misconception that unlocked all the others. I arrived believing London was one city with one personality. Instead, I found a place where every neighborhood seemed to introduce itself differently. Once I accepted that, everything else started making more sense. The different architecture, the different people, the different pace of life, even the way locals talked about where they lived. London wasn't confusing because it lacked an identity. It was confusing because it had so many of them. And that realization completely changed the way I stopped visiting London and finally started living in it. Another assumption I carried with me was that I was finally going to hear the British accent all day long. You know the one I'm talking about? The accent every American movie seems to use whenever someone intelligent, sophisticated, or slightly intimidating walks into the room. In my mind, London was basically an entire city full of people who sounded like BBC News presenters. So during my first few days here, I found myself quietly listening to conversations on buses and in cafes, almost waiting to hear that familiar voice I'd grown up associating with Britain. Instead, I became completely confused. Two people standing next to each other sometimes sounded like they had grown up on different continents. At first, I honestly thought my ears just weren't trained well enough. Maybe every British accent sounded different to me because I wasn't used to hearing them. But then I'd hear an Australian ordering coffee, an American family asking for directions, someone speaking Polish on the phone, a group chatting in Arabic, and another conversation switching effortlessly between English and another language I couldn't identify. It wasn't just that people had different British accents. It was that London sounded like the entire world had decided to meet in one city. One morning on the tube, I remember looking around and realizing that almost everyone in my carriage probably had a completely different story about how they ended up here. Some had families who had lived in London for generations. Others had moved here for university, work, or new opportunities. Some were probably tourists. Others were lifelong Londoners. It struck me that I could spend 20 minutes riding across the city and hear more languages than I sometimes heard in weeks back home. That isn't just my imagination either. More than 300 languages are spoken across London, making it one of the most linguistically diverse cities in the world. Communities with roots in India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Pakistan, Poland, Turkey, China, Romania, Ghana, and dozens of other countries have all shaped the city over generations. English is obviously the common language that ties everything together, but it exists alongside an incredible mix of cultures that constantly influence one another. Suddenly, the idea of one London accent started to seem almost funny. Even when everyone is speaking English, there isn't just one way of sounding British. Before moving here, I genuinely thought accents fell into two categories: British and not British. Then I discovered Cockney, Estuary English, multicultural London English, Scottish accents, Welsh accents, Irish accents, and regional English accents that locals can identify almost instantly while I still struggle to tell apart. Sometimes I'll think someone grew up 5 minutes away, only to discover they're from Manchester or Glasgow. Other times, someone sounds completely American until they casually mention they've lived in East London their whole life. My confidence in recognizing accents has been humbled on an almost weekly basis. The more I learned, the more I realized London's diversity isn't something new. It's actually part of the city's history. Since Roman times, London has been a trading city connected to the rest of the world. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, refugees, students, and workers have been arriving here for centuries. French Huguenots fled religious persecution and settled in London. Jewish communities established neighborhoods that became important cultural centers. After the Second World War, people from across the Caribbean helped rebuild Britain. Immigration from South Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond continued to reshape the city. London didn't suddenly become international. It has been evolving through waves of migration for hundreds of years. I think that's one reason London feels so different from the version many Americans picture. Movies often focus on tradition because tradition looks good on camera. Royal ceremonies, historic buildings, afternoon tea, those things certainly exist, but they're only part of the story. Walk through everyday London and you'll pass Nigerian restaurants next to Turkish bakeries, Polish grocery stores around the corner from Indian sweet shops, and cafes serving everything from Korean fried chicken to Lebanese pastries. Sometimes I'll realize I've eaten food from 3 different countries without ever leaving my neighborhood. One of my favorite little moments happened during a workday when I stopped for coffee before heading back to my flat. While waiting in line, I overheard 4 different conversations happening around me. One was in Spanish, another in English with a distinctly Scottish accent, another sounded Eastern European, and another switched back and forth between English and another language so naturally that nobody even seemed to notice. The barista effortlessly moved between customers as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world. And of course, for London, it is. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody treated it as unusual. It was just another Tuesday morning. That experience changed how I thought about British identity, especially in London. From the outside, it's easy to imagine British culture as one fixed thing that's remained unchanged for centuries. Living here made me realize it's much more dynamic than that. London doesn't replace its history with new cultures. It layers them together. Roman history, medieval streets, Victorian buildings, Caribbean music, South Asian cuisine, African businesses, European communities, modern finance, and global technology all exist simultaneously. It's messy sometimes, occasionally complicated, but also fascinating because the city keeps adding chapters instead of rewriting old ones. Of course, if there's one stereotype Americans are almost as confident about as British accents, it's the weather. Before I moved, people reacted as though I had announced I was relocating to the bottom of the ocean. "Hope you like rain," they would say. "Don't forget your umbrella. You'll never see the sun again." Honestly, by the time my plane landed, I expected London to resemble one long scene from a gloomy detective series where everyone permanently looked damp. So naturally, one of the first things I bought after arriving was a large umbrella. Not just any umbrella. I bought the kind that looked sturdy enough to survive a hurricane. I imagined I'd be carrying it every single day. Instead, I spent weeks awkwardly hauling this oversized umbrella around while everyone else walked past me, completely unbothered by weather that barely seemed worth mentioning. There I was, preparing for the apocalypse while Londoners were casually eating lunch outside. That's because the stereotype isn't entirely wrong, but it's definitely exaggerated. London is often gray, overcast skies are common. Light drizzle shows up often enough that locals barely react to it. But if you're imagining dramatic thunderstorms or tropical downpours every afternoon, you'll probably be disappointed. The rain here is usually subtle. It's almost polite. Sometimes it's less like rain and more like the air quietly deciding to becomes slightly wetter. Compared to many American cities, London's climate is actually remarkably moderate. Los Angeles is much hotter. Chicago gets far colder winters. New York sees more snow and bigger seasonal swings. Dallas experiences summer temperatures that make stepping outside feel like opening an oven door. London rarely reaches those extremes. Winters are relatively mild. Summers are usually comfortable. And although recent years have brought more frequent heat waves because of climate change, the city still spends most of the year somewhere in the middle. I started wondering why London's reputation became so dramatic if the weather itself often isn't. Part of the answer is psychology. We remember inconvenience much more vividly than normal days. If you spend a week visiting London and 2 afternoons happen to be rainy, those rainy afternoons become the story you tell your friends. Nobody comes home saying, "The weather was perfectly average." They remember getting caught in drizzle outside Buckingham Palace. The uncomfortable moments stick in our minds far longer than the ordinary ones. The city's gray skies probably contribute as well. Sunshine changes how we emotionally experience a place. An overcast afternoon can feel colder and wetter than it actually is, even if very little rain falls. That's something I had to adjust to after Southern California, where blue skies almost feel like a default setting. Here, a bright sunny day feels like everyone collectively won the lottery. Parks suddenly fill with people, outdoor cafes overflow, and you'll hear someone inevitably announce, "We have to make the most of it." As an American, I used to find that funny. Now I catch myself saying exactly the same thing. The biggest surprise wasn't that London gets rain. It was that life simply doesn't stop because of it. People don't cancel plans over a little drizzle. They don't wait indoors hoping the weather improves. They put on a jacket, keep walking, and carry on with whatever they were doing. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking the forecast quite so obsessively. That giant umbrella eventually disappeared into the back of a closet, where it still sits today collecting dust. And I realized that, just like the accents, the weather wasn't really the misconception. My expectations were. I had arrived looking for the London I'd seen in movies, when the real London had been quietly carrying on all along. Another idea I brought with me was that London was basically one giant historical monument where modern life somehow happened in the background. I imagined cobblestone streets everywhere, buildings untouched for centuries, and neighborhoods that looked exactly the way they did in old paintings. To be fair, London certainly has moments like that. You can turn a corner and suddenly find yourself standing beside a church that's older than the United States, but then you look up and see a glass skyscraper reflecting it back like a mirror. That contrast never really stops being surprising. London doesn't preserve its past by freezing it in time. It keeps building around it. One of my favorite walks in the city perfectly captures that feeling. Within the span of 15 minutes, I can pass Roman ruins hidden beneath modern office buildings, walk by medieval churches that somehow survived fires and wars, cross streets lined with elegant Victorian terraces, and then find myself surrounded by futuristic towers made almost entirely of glass. The first time I noticed this, it felt chaotic. Now it feels strangely logical. London's history isn't arranged in neat chapters. It's all happening at once. The reason for that becomes much clearer when you look at what this city has survived. London wasn't simply built and left alone. It has been destroyed, rebuilt, expanded, bombed, modernized, and reinvented over and over again. The Great Fire of 1666 wiped out much of the medieval city, forcing large-scale rebuilding. During the Victorian era, the Industrial Revolution transformed enormous areas as railways, housing, and infrastructure expanded to serve a rapidly growing population. Then came the Second World War, when the Blitz damaged thousands of buildings across London. Every generation inherited a city that needed rebuilding in some way, and each one added its own layer instead of trying to erase the previous one. If you have still not pressed the subscribe button, then please do it to know more things that Americans get wrong about London. I think that's why London feels so alive compared to cities that sometimes seem preserved behind glass. It's more like a family photo album, where every generation keeps adding pictures without throwing away the older ones. You don't have one version replacing another. You have Roman foundations supporting modern offices, Victorian train stations serving 21st century commuters, and centuries-old pubs filled with people discussing artificial intelligence over lunch. History here isn't something you visit. It's something you accidentally walk past on your way to buy groceries. Of course, that history also explains why navigating London can occasionally feel like negotiating with a particularly stubborn maze. Back in California, I trusted street grids. If I got lost, I could usually figure things out by looking at a map for 30 seconds. London humbled me almost immediately. More than once, Google Maps confidently told me my destination was 2 minutes away, while I somehow managed to walk in a complete circle. I began to suspect the city was playing practical jokes on newcomers. Eventually, I learned that London's streets make perfect sense. They're just following rules written hundreds of years ago. Unlike cities that were carefully planned before they expanded, London grew organically. Roads often followed Roman routes, old village paths, farm boundaries, or property lines that existed centuries before anyone imagined traffic lights or automobiles. That's why streets suddenly curve, narrow unexpectedly, or seem to ignore every principle of modern city planning. What initially looked random was actually history hiding in plain sight. Then there was another misconception I never questioned because it seemed so obvious. I assumed everyone in London drove. Not because anyone had specifically told me that, but because driving is such a normal part of American life that I couldn't imagine a major city working differently. In Southern California, owning a car isn't just convenient. For many people, it feels almost essential. Grocery store car, coffee, car meeting friends, car going for a walk sometimes even requires driving somewhere first. I assumed London would be similar, just with narrower roads and smaller cars. Instead, one of the first questions people asked me wasn't whether I had a car, it was whether I had an Oyster card. That should have been my first clue. I realized conversations about transportation usually started with, take the tube, just get the bus, or it's only a 20-minute walk. Driving rarely entered the discussion at all. In fact, several people I met either didn't own a car or barely used one. Some didn't even have a driver's license. As an American, that genuinely surprised me. At first, I thought that sounded inconvenient. Then my own habits slowly changed without me noticing. I started walking to buy groceries because the store was only a few minutes away. I'd take the tube across the city for dinner, switch to a bus on the way home, and never think twice about it. Some days, I'd use 3 different forms of public transportation before dinner and barely remember doing it. The biggest surprise wasn't learning how to navigate London's transit system. It was realizing how quickly I stopped missing my car. There's actually a practical reason so many Londoners choose not to drive. Owning a car here can be expensive before you've even turned the key. Parking is limited, insurance can be costly, fuel isn't cheap, and drivers entering central London may have to pay congestion charges. Depending on the vehicle, there can also be ultra-low emission zone fees designed to reduce pollution. None of these policies exist simply to make life difficult. Together, they encourage people to use the extensive public transportation network that the city has spent generations building. Once I understood that, something clicked for me. Transportation doesn't just change how people move, it changes how they live. In many American cities, daily life stretches outward because highways make distance feel normal. In London, the underground, buses, trains, cycling routes, and walkable neighborhoods pull life inward. Local businesses thrive because people pass them every day on foot. Parks become part of people's routines instead of weekend destinations. Friends often meet somewhere halfway along a tube line rather than worrying about parking. The infrastructure quietly shapes the culture. I even noticed it affecting my own routine as someone who works remotely. Instead of planning an entire afternoon around running errands, I'd simply walk out of my flat, stop at the grocery store, grab a coffee, maybe pick up a few things from the pharmacy, and be home again within half an hour. I wasn't making fewer trips than I did in California. I was making smaller ones. Somehow, life started feeling both busier and simpler at the same time. And finally, there was perhaps the biggest stereotype of all. Before moving here, if someone had asked me to picture London, my mind would have immediately jumped to Buckingham Palace, royal weddings, ceremonial guards, and the monarchy. American media has done such an incredible job connecting London with royalty that it's easy to assume royal life dominates the city. I honestly expected conversations about the royal family to come up constantly, almost the way sports might dominate conversations in some American cities. Then I moved here and discovered that most people were far more interested in whether the train was delayed than what was happening at the palace. That's not to say the monarchy isn't important. Royal traditions remain a significant part of Britain's identity and attract millions of visitors every year. Ceremonies, state occasions, and historic landmarks are woven into London's story. But for most residents, those things exist in the background of ordinary life. People are thinking about work deadlines, grocery shopping, meeting friends after work, picking up their kids from school, or whether their football team is going to ruin their weekend again. The famous postcard version of London is real, but it's only one layer sitting on top of millions of ordinary lives. I remember walking past Buckingham Palace one afternoon and seeing crowds of tourists carefully lining up for photos while, just a few streets away, office workers hurried toward the tube with takeaway coffees in hand, barely glancing in its direction. Neither group was wrong. They were simply experiencing different Londons at exactly the same time. One came to see history, the other was just trying to get home before rush hour. Living here has taught me that London is full of these parallel realities. Tourists look up at famous landmarks, residents look down at train schedules, visitors memorize monuments, locals memorize the quickest route to their favorite bakery. Neither experience is more authentic than the other, but they're remarkably different. And once you begin living here, everyday routines slowly become more fascinating than the landmarks you once dreamed about seeing. When I think back to the person who stepped off the plane 2 years ago, I'm actually grateful she got so many things wrong. If all my expectations had been accurate, I probably wouldn't have paid attention. Surprise forces you to look closer. It makes you ask better questions. Every misconception I had became an invitation to understand the city a little more deeply instead of simply checking famous places off a list. Now, when friends back home ask me what London is really like, I never know how to answer in one sentence. It's ancient and modern, quiet and busy, local and global, traditional and constantly changing. It's a city where medieval streets lead to financial skyscrapers, where hundreds of languages blend into the sound of an ordinary commute, where drizzle rarely interrupts anyone's plans, and where entire neighborhoods still feel like villages. Despite being part of one of the world's largest capitals, I used to think I understood London because I'd seen it in movies, books, and travel shows. What I actually knew was London's postcard. The real city revealed itself much more slowly, in morning walks to the grocery store, conversations overheard on the tube, wrong turns that became unexpected discoveries, and ordinary days that quietly rewrote everything I thought I knew. And maybe that is the biggest lesson London has taught me. The places we think we know best are often the ones we understand the least, until we stop trying to see what we expected and finally start noticing what is actually there. Do subscribe to our channel and also press the like button, as this motivated us to make more amazing videos for you all.